A devastated ruin in a pockmarked landscape that turned the tide of the Second World War.
Many believe this was a suicide mission.
An extraordinary tall building which became known as the Tower of Death.
Ever since man has been building things, there's always been a contest to see who can build the highest.
A concrete structure stranded at sea that came to a gruesome end.
It's creepy. There was really no escape. This is a tomb.
And a heavy metal monster in a remote field in northern England.
It's got an almost primitive, animalistic quality, like some kind of extinct dinosaur.
Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today, they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? On a headland in Normandy, in northwestern France, at the top of 30-meter-high cliffs, there's a strange and unexpected sight.
Through the mist, a large concrete structure emerges, set on the point of the peninsula.
And on top of the building is a vast phallic-like structure reaching up into the heavens and entirely dominating the region.
Beneath the concrete, corridors lead to empty rooms.
There's no feeling of humanity about them. These could almost be chambers designed by machines for machines.
And the pockmarked fields that surround it serve only to deepen its mystery.
Around it, there are ominous-looking craters in the ground as far as the eye can see. The landscape is almost lunar.
This is a place where something has gone dreadfully wrong.
But what has caused such devastation? The answer lies in a single day that changed the course of history. When the Allies invaded France to liberate Europe from the Nazi scourge. D-Day. It was the largest seaborne invasion in history. In all, 156,000 Allied troops were involved, carrying out a plan that had been agreed at the top-secret Quebec Conference between the British, American, and Canadian governments in August 1943. At its head were two illustrious names. Appointed as Supreme Commander was the US General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The man chosen to command 21st Army Group, which comprised all the land forces, was the British General Bernard Montgomery.
Germany knew that it could not win a war on two fronts. It could not face both the onslaught of the Soviet Union from the east and an attack in the west.
The Germans were faced with a strategic problem. Coastal France had to be fortified at all costs. So they began work on an extended defensive wall, as tour guide Anthony Lewis explains.
The Atlantic Wall, which was a system of defense measures, which started in North Norway and went along a coastline of France for some 1,670 miles, all the way down to the Spanish coastline.
But how did the Germans decide where to concentrate those defenses? Where did they expect the Allied invasion to be made?
German high command was split as to where the attack would come. Hitler was personally convinced it would come across the shortest route from Dover to Calais. But more experienced minds knew that actually there were better attack sites that would also have the element of surprise.
The most important fortification along this critical stretch of the Normandy coast was here at Pointe du Hoc. It gave an unobstructed view of the English Channel and a clear line of fire onto the beaches below. Perched on top of a high cliff, it was the perfect position for a coastal battery.
This was one of 2 German covered casements, which housed one of the 6 155mm cannons. And each one averaged some 660 tons of concrete, and at the same time strengthening it with some 50 tons of metal bars. If incoming shells impacted on the building, then only a small part of it would be destroyed.
These 6 guns were going to pose a serious threat to the invasion plans. They were sandwiched between Utah Beach and Omaha Beach, 2 of the 5 beaches on which Allied troops would land.
Utah Beach was 8 miles to the west. Omaha Beach, 5 miles to the east. Now, these 155mm guns had a range of 12 miles. So imagine the carnage that they would have reaped on those beaches. The Allies had no choice but to take them out.
The task of destroying the guns fell to an elite combat unit, the US Army Rangers.
The Rangers were young, immensely physically fit, and very bright, motivated people who could be given an immensely difficult task and could be counted on to perform it against overwhelming odds.
The Rangers' mission was very specifically to land, scale the cliffs, and take out the German position on Pointe du Hoc.
But those cliffs were 30 meters high and almost vertical. And the Rangers would be facing over 200 German troops. What were their chances of success?
Many believe this was a suicide mission.
Early on June 6, 1944, nearly 160,000 Allied troops set off from England towards Nazi-occupied France. D-Day had begun.
This was an armada of 7,000 ships, the largest amphibious invasion in history, and it was coming their way.
As those ships started to get closer, the Germans were being bombarded from the air, bombarded from the sea. The flashes from all those guns lit up the June morning.
The Rangers' original plan was to land at Pointe du Hoc, but there was a problem.
Unfortunately, because of the very high tide that day, the very strong tide, which was running from west to east, from left to right, it dragged the boats down beyond the Pointe du Hoc.
By the time the Rangers reached Pointe du Hoc, they were 40 minutes behind schedule, and the US bombardment of the battery had stopped.
They've stopped bombarding Pointe du Hoc to let the Americans land without being blown up. But there's so much delay in landing that the Germans are able to come out of hiding, get out of their bunkers, and man their defensive positions.
The Rangers had to shoot ropes and rope ladders, heavy and drenched with water, into the cliffs, climb those ropes, themselves wearing sopping clothing.
They were under constant fire as they climbed the cliff. It must have been a terrifying prospect.
The Germans were throwing down potato masher grenades, and those are shock grenades. They're designed to deafen and stun people. And the Americans are climbing up, holding on with their fingertips and toes to tiny rock outcroppings.
When one Ranger fell, another took his place. When his rope was cut, he found another. They even used daggers to claw their way up.
It's hard to envisage now. The scene is so calm, looking out over the gentle waters of the Channel. But then the scene would have been unimaginable, climbing up a wet cliff face with all of the noise and the incredible chaos of warfare. It was one of the most dangerous and spectacular missions of World War II.
When they reached the top, there was fierce close-quarter fighting. But the Rangers were totally unprepared for what they found when they finally made it into the bunkers.
Do they see 155mm French guns with German sights ready to shoot down? No. They see trees, phone poles painted black. And they must instantly have been concerned that the entire mission, all of the death and effort that they'd put in to get onto Pointe du Hoc, had all been for nothing.
It must have been a huge blow. Why were the guns not there?
The Allies' aerial bombardment of the region had been so intense in preparation for D-Day that the Germans had moved the guns out of harm's way.
In fact, the guns were hidden down a nearby dirt track. The Rangers hunted them down and destroyed them.
The mission didn't end cleanly. Reinforcements were supposed to arrive, but they never came. The Rangers were left to defend the position for days.
Eventually, the Rangers were relieved. But out of 225 men, only 90 had survived. This battle-scarred area has barely changed since the Rangers took Pointe du Hoc. A statue of a dagger commemorates the men who, against all odds, clawed their way up the cliffs.
The site is deeply impressive for its vastness. But underneath that, there's a very simple story, and it's a very common story in war, about one person facing another person and the sheer courage and determination to see the mission through.
In the north of England, just outside the city of Leeds, there is a completely unexpected sight.
If you come on this thing through the morning mists, it looks like some kind of a giant factory sitting on these two platforms with a huge crane out front.
All of a sudden, there's metal everywhere, this huge, gigantic bit of engineering. What's it doing there?
It's got an almost primitive, animalistic quality, like some kind of extinct dinosaur.
Lying in a remote field is a tangled confusion of heavy-duty metal, pulleys, and rusting wheels.
It's got this big long arm at the front of it with triangle bits of steel all composed together. And it's got these slightly strange-looking features on either side. And it sort of leaves you wondering, well, what was that machine actually used for?
What's even stranger is that this machine was built in America before it somehow ended up in the north of England. But why was this strange-looking industrial object sent from its original home in the USA to England? And most importantly, how is it connected to an environmental disaster here that changed the northern landscape forever? The story begins in the dark days following the Second World War. In 1945, a Labour government was returned under the new Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. It was elected on a platform of social reform, but its plans were expensive and Britain's treasury was practically bankrupt. It was called the Age of Austerity. Wartime rationing continued and was even extended. Matters weren't helped when one of the coldest winters on record began in 1946. Factories were closed, the rail system was shut down, and coal supplies ran low. Many people suffered in the severe cold. So with Britain struggling to recover after the war, its great ally, the United States, came to its aid.
After World War II, the economies of Europe were really in shambles, and the US did something really quite visionary. We recognized that these countries had to get back on their feet economically. So a lot of the investment in helping build roads and bridges and railroads came from the US, and so did a lot of the equipment.
This Leviathan was an integral part of the US rescue plan. It became known as Oddball. The colossal machine arrived from the US in 1953. At 1,200 tons, it was the second largest machine of its kind anywhere in the world. It was intended to help to kick-start one of Britain's most vital industries.
Oddball is a piece of machinery that's used in mining, and what it does is that it drags the layers of soil off the top of coal reserves, so it exposes the seams of the coal.
When you have coal near the surface, it's usually covered by some soil and some rock that's uneconomic. It's stuff you don't want actually in your ore. So in order to get rid of that, you use this dragline system.
While it might look like quite a complex piece of machinery, what it's doing is actually really simple, because in simple terms, it's using a bucket to drag material up and then using ropes and chains to then dump that material in a different place.
Roy Lee is Oddball's only surviving driver.
Obviously, you can see the size. Quite a big bucket, really. When you stood inside, you can see how big it is. Capable of holding, 40, 50 tons of a burden.
While it might look cumbersome, Oddball was a very effective piece of machinery. It only took 30 seconds to scoop up and dump each bucket of soil and rock. And it could move the equivalent of its own weight in just half an hour.
It's a very efficient way of mining because you can drag away the material, mine it, and then dump it behind as you go along. So you can fill up the gap that you're leaving as you excavate the coal in your open cast mine.
Such a huge machine required a deft pair of hands to operate it safely.
So you sleeve it with the pedals on the floor, right and left. You've got a drag lever for pulling the bucket in and a hoist lever for lifting it up. You're not using any brakes, whatever, just balancing the power and keeping control of it as best as you can.
Oddball's bucket was a dangerous thing, particularly when it was full.
I don't think anybody could have got my hands off of these levers while I was in this seat. You realise that you've got to respect the machine all the time.
The challenge with these massive cranes is once they've dug all the coal that's in reach of their boom or their bucket, then what? You've got to be able to move them every few hours or every few days. This thing's got to move to a new location.
You can see it's got these, it looks like a couple of feet, really. And actually, these are the key to how it moves around. It actually lifts the whole of the unit up on these flat feet and then sort of shuffles back, a little bit like you were trying to move yourself back on the ground if you were lying down.
Even though it moved only backwards, 2 meters at a time, and at a speed of 0.3 kilometers per hour, it was still difficult for the driver to see what was going on.
We did have a wing mirror positioned on here so we could see the banksman and tried to lean out as much as we could to get the instructions from him when it was safe to move or to hold us up if there were anything in the way.
It's totally like nothing you've seen before. It's like Star Wars and Thunderbirds meets coal mining. That's how I would describe it, but it's a very, very elegant thing. And it just lifts it up on these little legs and shuffles around. A very, very ingenious way of being able to do open cast mining.
By 1988, Oddball had been moved here to St Aidan's in the north of England. But it wasn't a lake then. It was the biggest open-cast mine in Yorkshire, which had produced 6 million tons of coal over a period of 10 years. But what catastrophic event caused such an enormous site to become flooded? And how did Oddball manage to escape a watery grave?
The mine was very close, probably too close, to a river. So they were digging this mine in a lowland area, a wet area, and then as they dig out the coal, of course, they're making this massive pit.
They'd protected the riverbank with a wall of interlocking steel. But it wasn't enough.
As they were mining, water started coming out of cracks in the side of one of the coal seams, and a river they'd actually diverted then started to also contribute to the water coming in.
It took just hours for the steel wall to collapse completely.
It was just like Niagara Falls in a way, with water vapour and the amount of water coming in. It was a complete disaster, and everybody knew it. That were, as far as we were concerned, that looked like the end of our jobs.
More than 15 billion litres of water flooded the site.
It was a mile long, it was probably half a mile wide, it was 200 foot deep. There was so much area to fill with water, it took 4 days to fill it up. And then, of course, we knew that the machines weren't going to work again for quite a while.
Oddball survived, but it was 10 years before they were able to mine the area again.
By the time the flood had subsided and the mine was actually ready to be excavated again, technology had moved on pretty quickly, and so modern technology basically replaced the dragline, and the dragline became redundant.
On a misty morning in January 1999, Oddball took its final walk. Today, it sits here on the site of the former St Aidan's mine, one of only a handful of machines of its kind ever built.
I'm a big fan of preserving the legacy of our industrial technological history, especially these massive pieces of equipment, because I think so many of us, we don't think about all the hard work, all the ingenuity, the technology it took to build this modern world.
Out at sea, in Southeast Asia, at the mouth of Manila Bay in the Philippines, is an extraordinary structure in the shape of a warship.
This military behemoth is impressive, immense, and completely mind-blowing.
This huge concrete structure is pierced with slits and openings that reveal incredibly thick walls. And you can see it's all reinforced with steel bars.
Why is this ancient warship that looks like it's carved from stone sitting in the water at the entrance to Manila Bay?
Being inside this huge structure only deepens the mystery. Its dark interior is littered with crumbling concrete and rusted steel. And its charred walls hint that something catastrophic happened here.
You can see where the wall is beginning to buckle. And then over here, you can see where the entire floor has just given way. And the sea is just starting to pour in.
There's twisted metal and rubble everywhere. Whatever happened here, you can't imagine that much could have survived.
What was the purpose of this concrete warship? And what connection does it have to one of the grisliest events of the Second World War? To find out, we need to look to the imperial expansion of the United States during the early 20th century. In 1898, Spain and the US fought a brief war, which the US won. Spain was forced to surrender most of its empire, including the Philippines. They became the jewel in America's crown, and they had to be protected at all costs. And this concrete warship was the key to doing just that. Albert Labrador is a local historian.
When the Americans took over the Philippines in 1898, they basically sailed right in and sank the Spanish fleet. And so they realized that they needed a defense system to prevent the same thing that they did to the Spanish.
A major part of the system was this construction, which was placed on the tiny island of El Fraile.
At the mouth of Manila Bay are a cluster of islands, some of them fairly large, like Corregidor, and some of them actually quite small, like El Fraile. And these make, at the entrance of the bay, actually almost perfect locations for this new development of coast artillery.
The plan was to construct fortifications on each of these 5 islands. And this one was the toughest. The heavily fortified island of El Fraile, known as Fort Drum. But would it work?
They took an island and they essentially just leveled the island down to the bedrock. And they built a massive concrete structure with 2 what look like essentially battleship turrets, which are ship-killing guns.
You can see the huge wire-wound 14-inch batteries. You can imagine the diameter of the shell. Each shell weighed more than a ton, and it could be lobbed 5 miles out. So you can imagine the reach and cover of these guns across the entire bay.
Fort Drum was formidable. It was packed with searchlights. It had anti-aircraft batteries and a fire control tower. And hidden beneath the concrete exterior were another 3 levels, which housed equipment and up to 240 troops.
We're looking right now at the 3rd and 4th level. This is where the living spaces and the mess would be. Beneath this would be a further level with generators and water.
These corridors were stocked with everything that would be needed in the event of an attack. But who did the US think might make the attack? And why is the fort now in such terrible condition?
There was this perception in America in the early 20th century that the Japanese were going to invade. It was driven by a belief that the peoples of East Asia were a threat to the Western world. It's inevitable that at some point they're going to collide.
And collide they did, infamously on December the 8th, 1941, at Pearl Harbor. On the same day that the Japanese attacked there, they also invaded the Philippines. There were several reasons for the Japanese attack. Japan was determined to build an empire in the Pacific, and the Philippines were a vital gateway. In effect, whoever controlled them controlled the entire Pacific. As well as providing a direct route to Australia and the Oceania region, the Philippines also connect the North and South Pacific. But there was another reason. The islands were under the control of the Americans, and the US was Japan's main enemy in the Pacific. The area saw some of the war's most bitter fighting. When it began, all the fortifications around Manila Bay came under attack, including Fort Drum. Somehow it had to be able to hold out against the might of the Japanese Navy.
Fort Drum begins to play a part at the very first day of the war. And so for the next 5 months until the 5th of May, Fort Drum will be both a target of air and gun attacks from the Japanese.
I'm sure if you were inside the garrison of Fort Drum, the shelling and other bombardment would have been intense, but perhaps you would have felt safe in the fact that the walls were so thick and strong that you knew that you weren't going to die.
Despite being under siege, the troops on Fort Drum were still able to inflict heavy casualties on the Japanese invasion fleet. Nothing it did could destroy the fort's guns.
The turrets are made of armor steel, basically the same material that you would make battleships out of, since they're battleship turrets. And over here, the roof is steel reinforced concrete. So nothing the Japanese threw at this was able to penetrate.
But on May the 6th, 1942, when the battle for the Philippines was lost, the American troops inside Fort Drum were finally forced to surrender.
It was able to withstand constant Japanese bombardment without a single major casualty. There were no deaths. But this thing was so sturdy that Japanese forces on either side, lobbing heavy artillery onto it for months, did no real damage to it.
The island's fighting days, however, were far from over. For the next 3 years, Fort Drum was under Japanese control. That was until April the 13th, 1945, when 2 US landing craft arrived to take it back.
American combat engineers very bravely approach this structure, which is bristling with guns, and they pipe a mixture of diesel fuel and gasoline into it. And they then fire tracer rounds into the fort.
Down below were Japanese soldiers who refused to surrender. They must have known what was coming.
The explosion was so powerful that one of the hatches over here that weighed about a ton was thrown 300 feet in the air.
Deep within the fort, the charred walls are a stark reminder of the horrific fate of the Japanese troops.
So we've now entered the 3rd level down. When the Americans poured gasoline down the hatches on the surface, most of it would have settled down here. And that is the reason why most of the dead Japanese, 60 of the 68 bodies, were found charred in this area. There was really no escape. They couldn't have fought their way out, and so this is a tomb. But it's creepy knowing that 60 people burned to their deaths in here with no chance of getting out. It was 4 days before the Americans could get in because the heat was unbearable.
Fort Drum was abandoned. Scarred by the horrors of war, it still sits in these waters off the coast of the Philippines. It has been stripped bare by looters, and few people today even know of its existence. A sad end to an extraordinary piece of military history.
Defense of Fort Drum, as impressive as it was, has basically been forgotten in the annals of military history. This is a story that really should be told.
In the heart of Russia lies Yekaterinburg, the country's 4th largest city. And at its center is an astonishing sight.
You see this very tall, grey concrete structure towering over the rest of the city, and it's very, very distinct because of its immense height.
What strikes you about it is just impossibly thin and tall. It's hard to believe that something that seems that delicate could actually stand up and not be at risk of falling down.
At 220 meters tall, it dominates the skyline.
Giant towers appeal to the wonder in all of us. Ever since man has been building things, there's always been a contest to see who can build the highest.
It's hard to believe it didn't have some kind of symbolic intent behind it.
Now, graffiti covers its walls. The concrete is crumbling, and a gaping black hole hints that something dreadful once happened here. And to the locals, it has a dark reputation.
Most of the people in the city refer to the tower as being a kind of abandoned ghost site.
But what happened here to make this tower so infamous? And why is it known to the people who live here as the Tower of Death? To discover why, we need to go back to the Cold War between the West and what was then the Soviet Union during the last century.
Going back to the early days of the Soviet Union, supremacy in science and technology was vitally important to them. They wanted to prove that their system could produce better scientists, better engineering.
The Cold War era saw huge investment by both Eastern and Western governments in technology and science research. While much of it was aimed at winning the space race and developing nuclear weapons, many other areas such as ecology, biomedicine, agriculture, and computer science also received huge state funding. There was also intense competition between East and West to prove which side could build the biggest and the best. And that included the race to build the world's tallest structures. By the early 1980s, the West was clearly winning, but the Soviet Union wanted to show it was still in the game. And this was one of the ways it did it: Yekaterinburg's television tower. Propaganda was essential to spreading the socialist message, and television was its most important medium.
TV is an enormously effective way to communicate. If you control the 3 or 4 TV channels that are available in your country, you really dominate the conversation.
At 365 meters high, the television tower would be the tallest in Europe, according to engineer Daniel Kriski.
It was to consist of 2 main parts, a 720-foot reinforced concrete column, and above that, a 460-foot metal antenna.
The tower would house television studios, have a revolving restaurant at the top, and it would be visible for miles. However, the builders faced many challenges.
You would need to build some scaffolding tower in the right shape. You would have had to build what we call formwork, which is bits of timber that are shaped, and it's the mold within which the concrete is poured. So you need to be agile and thinking about the design of the tower in different portions of it, because it was so very tall.
And for the men who helped to build the tower, there was always danger and the potential for disaster.
They poured rings of concrete one on top of each other, gradually working their way up. Each tier would be about 2.5 meters high, and they would have to, let one begin to cure and then build the next one on top of it and gradually work their way up as they went. But you can imagine as they got high, the challenge of moving all that liquid concrete up to this enormously tall structure must have been formidable.
Even a shortage of building materials and extreme cold weather didn't stop construction.
It wasn't just a tower designed to broadcast propaganda, but the tower itself was intended to be a form of propaganda, an actual physical landmark that represented the superiority of the Soviet system.
But when so much had been invested in the tower, what could have happened to cause such devastation? Was there a construction accident? Or could the reasons be connected to the volatile political situation in the Soviet Union in the early 1990s? Or could the tower have been the target of a terrorist attack? The reason was more prosaic.
So they worked on it for 8 years. They still only got about 2/3 of it done. And the money ran out, and the society was no longer able to function in a way to build this kind of project.
A great symbol of Soviet prestige was now a stark reminder of its failure. But there is one more question to be answered. Why was it known as the Tower of Death? Shortly after construction ground to a halt, the tower began to be used for very different purposes. And they were ones that would have fatal consequences.
The tower became this magnet for young people to gather and express themselves. People climbed it over and over again. There was sort of a nonstop party up at the top. And then some daredevils started climbing it blindfolded. And of course, you know, there were accidents, and one young man died. Others climbed the tower as a way to commit suicide in a very dramatic fashion.
The television tower had now become the Tower of Death. Soon, it was barricaded up so that no one would ever die here again. On March the 24th, 2018, the local authority decided to demolish Yekaterinburg's most striking landmark. Now, there is nothing left of the tower that once dominated the city's skyline. In its place, they're building an ice rink.
I can understand why the tower was such a landmark and sort of beloved by some people in the city. On the other hand, I don't think anyone wants the symbol of their city to be something that was a colossal failure, a white elephant.
When it's not being used, when the fact that it was unfinished, and the fact that you can actually demolish that and then make way for new cultural activities is a positive step forward. And I think it is important to move on with the times and provide the city with what it needs in the modern era.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.